all of you. Let me welcome you to this special lecture by Professor Takahara on theme of Belt and Road Initiative and Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Are they compatible? We are really honored to have speaker, scholar of Professor Takahara's eminence and erudition to give this special lecture this afternoon. Professor Takahara is a very well-known Chinese scholar from Japan who has written extensively on China-Japan relations. He is a professor of contemporary Chinese politics at the Graduate School for Law and Politics and Dean of Graduate School Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. He has many other hats that he wears, including Senior Fellow of the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research, Senior Adjunct Fellow of the Japan Institute of International Affairs, and Distinguished Research Fellow of the Japan Forum on International Relations. As I mentioned, he has written extensively, his most recent book being Japan-China Relations in the Modern Era, which was brought out by Routledge in 2017. Professor Takahara will be talking today on a very interesting theme. He'll be looking at two very important initiatives which have been taken over the last half a dozen years. Belt and Road Initiative, which is widely seen as signature project personally attributed to President Xi Jinping, which was initiated in late 2013. And he'll also be looking at the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which is again a concept associated with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan, but which in fact dates back in a way more than almost dozen years, because it was here in New Delhi when Prime Minister Abe, during his first term as Premier of Japan, was paying an official visit and addressed the Parliament of India. And this is when he talked about the confluence of two oceans or two seas. And so the core of this concept was developed at that time, but it was formally launched as a vision and a strategy for Free and Open Indo-Pacific in April 2017. Often, these concepts are seen as competing ideas, but today Professor Takahara will be exploring the aspect of compatibility in the two mega projects or initiatives. That's, I understand, is going to be the main theme of his presentation, and I'm sure it will be of great interest to this very distinguished audience that we have assembled here this afternoon. We are lucky, we are fortunate that Ambassador Deepa Wadhwa has kindly agreed to chair today's lecture and also moderate discussions which will follow after Professor Takahara's remarks. You're all familiar with Ambassador Wadhwa. I don't need to introduce her. Among other things, she has been Ambassador of India to Japan, and we also in the ICS claim her as part of our family. She is a member of Governing Council of the Institute of Chinese Studies. So over to Deepa now. You have to conduct the proceedings.
Thanks, Ashok. We are really very grateful to the Japanese Embassy and the ICS for giving us.
If I may, sorry, I didn't mention that. If I could interrupt. This program is being arranged jointly between Institute of Chinese Studies and Embassy of Japan. We are really grateful to Embassy of Japan first for bringing a scholar of Professor Takahara's eminence and then suggesting that ICS co-host this event.
Right, so that was just what I was going to say. I think it's wonderful that we get a Japanese perspective on what is happening in China and the Japan-China relationship. I think a lot of you would perhaps remember that just a year ago, exactly a year ago in October 2018, I think a lot of us were rather surprised to find that Japan, who had decided not to join the AIIB, seemed to have said that they were ready to join the BRI. Now, why I say this is because we've been going by mainly Western reports, and I think there's some nuanced differences. I certainly saw a report that said from the Chinese side that Japan said that they would, in fact, Prime Minister Abe, when he visited, said that Japan would actively participate. But I think the Japan response was far more nuanced. They also talked, beyond talking about the BRI, there was also some talk about cooperating in specific projects. And as you know, Japan and India are also talking about cooperating in projects in third countries. So I think we were looking at this with great interest and see how this would work out. As Ashok mentioned, the free and open Indo-Pacific, the concept, the construct now, which is kind of gained in salience, nobody questions it any longer. Yes, it did have its birth, I think, in a way, in India, in Delhi, when it was endorsed by Prime Minister Abe. It had come out of some, I think, academics had mentioned it, and endorsed during his talk to Parliament in 2007, and thereafter developed. It is really interesting. We look forward to hearing from Professor Takahara about how these two could be compatible, the compatibility, because there is yet another third dimension to this, and I'm sure Professor Takahara will speak about it, which is that about the time that the BRI was launched, Prime Minister Abe spoke about yet another initiative which was kind of at that point of time seemed to be in competition with the BRI, which he called the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, and now an expanded partnership for quality infrastructure. So we look forward now to hearing from Professor Takahara. I'm sure he will answer a lot of our questions and doubts we have in the course of his talk, and thereafter we will take questions from the audience. Professor Takahara.
Good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kanto, Ambassador Barbara, for your very kind introduction, and for me to have this great opportunity. Thank you very much for coming here, distinguished guests. I've been traveling southern part of Asia the past few days. I was first in Pakistan, then I went to Sri Lanka, and now I'm here in India. But I've been shocked in the past two countries that whenever I mention the two words, Japan and India, Japan and China, immediately people think that, oh, those two adversaries, rivals, oh, you're fighting with each other. That's not the case. That's not the case. The world is not that simple, is it? It's not black or white. Of course, on the one hand, we are facing difficulties in dealing with militarily rising China. I hope I have the time to explain to you what sort of pressure we are getting from China's military rise. So with one hand, there's no question we have to compete with China ferociously. China is so big, it's increasing its military budget in such a pace, we cannot catch up, but we have to try. But on the other hand, we are shaking hands very tightly with China. We all benefit. I'm sure India is in the same boat. We do benefit a lot from our economic cooperation with the Chinese. So in a way, we are in a kind of a China dilemma, or facing a China aporia, because on the one hand, we promote our economic exchange and cooperation. By that, China grows its national power, and with that, China increases its military might. So how are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to give a solution to such an aporia? Very, very difficult. We must find a way, and I'm pretty sure that many countries, including yours and mine, are in the same boat, and we are searching for ways to maintain peace and find a path of mutual cooperation and development while we do compete fiercely with one hand. So that's the background to it. Yes, and in the two countries that I visited recently, Some people mentioned the recent defense white paper that was issued by Japan, and I didn't know about it, but apparently some Western media have reported that Japan now calls China the greatest threat. I don't think that's true. I have to go home and check the exact wording, but there is no possibility that the Japanese government will call another country a threat. So please do not believe whenever some Western media in particular, I'm not sure about the Indian media, I'm sorry, I haven't been reading the Indian media, but those people, I'm afraid if there are some here, you may have some things to say afterwards, but when Japan and China have issues, many countries are rather happy about that. And they tend to focus on these conflicts and confrontations. But please do check the original when you feel that something's funny. Because I'm pretty sure, 100% sure, that in the defense white paper we did not mention call China the largest threat to Japan. That reminds me of Mr. Abe's, how Mr. Abe's been reported in the Western press for a long time. Not that I particularly liked how he talked about history before he became Prime Minister. But after he became Prime Minister, I think he has been very prudent. But all the Western media that came to Japan in those early years of his second administration, when they interviewed me, they all wanted me to criticize Abe. Come, criticize Abe. And I was a bit fed up. Come on, you have to look objectively at this guy. Please judge him by what he actually says and does. And I once was talking about these things with a journalist that came from a very well-known British media. And he seemed to be a very nice person, so I confided in him, this is what I'm facing, and he said, I fully understand, it's a problem about the editors and so on and so forth. So I had been hoping that when he went home, he would write a good article, but it was the same. So it's not easy to find out what are the facts. So please check the original when you have the slight question in your head that, this sounds funny. Nowadays, even the Japanese are translating their documents into English more than before. So it should be easier now. And with that background, I would like to talk about the BRI first. Yes, what is the Belt and Road Initiative? Now, I think it's helpful for us to understand the BRI in the Chinese diplomatic context. That is, when Xi Jinping came to power, 2012, or even a bit before that, for him and for the Chinese leadership, of course, the most important relationship was that with the United States, right? So if you remember, they came up with a new slogan, yes? The new type of major country relations, the new type of major power relations, 新型大国关系, that was the new phrase. And we were all puzzled, right? What do they mean by new type of major country relations? And what the Chinese explained to us was, we don't want to fight the big power, the existing big power. We are a rising big power, and many people say that a rising power and a hegemonic power, they are destined to war with each other. But that's not the case. We can coexist peacefully. That was the main message. So we have to mutually respect core interests. We have to establish a cooperative and win-win relationship. That's what the Chinese started to tell the Americans. And the Obama administration first said, oh, it's not a bad idea. We can take it up. So even President Obama used this phrase many times first. However, eventually, gradually, the Americans started to see that there's no go because of many issues that highlighted the strategic competition that they could not hide. Yes, in the cyberspace, and also, especially on the maritime front, East China Sea issues, South China Sea issues, the Americans first thought that it's okay to say that we respect your core interests, because China's core interests, what are they? Well, sovereignty over Taiwan, sovereignty over Tibet, over Xinjiang, That's okay. We've been acknowledging that for some time, so no problem. However, the Chinese started to expand their definition, right? And they openly started to say that the South China Sea is part of their core interest. And at one point of time, the spokesperson of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs even said that the Senkakus, the Diaoyu in their language, is of course a core interest. That's what she said. And November 2013, the Chinese suddenly announced the Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, over the East China Sea. And since then, the Americans, even President Obama, stopped using the phrase. But the Chinese kept on saying, whenever Xi Jinping and Obama met, that both sides agreed to promote the new type of major country relations, but that was not quite true. The American side stopped using that phrase very clearly. And the Chinese, of course, they knew that there was no go in the new type of major country relations, so even though they kept on using that term, they started to change the priorities in their diplomatic policy. So from 2014, 2015, Wang Yi said it very clearly, now the top priority of our diplomatic policy is the Belt and Road Initiative. So when we review the development, the evolution of Chinese diplomatic policy, we will find that whenever, even much before that, whenever Beijing had issues with Washington, they would turn to Tokyo. They would turn to Bonn in the Cold War days, now to Berlin. So that's the swing in the pendulum that was happening in 2013, 2014, and even today. Yes. So issues with the United States, so from America first-ism, not in the Trumpist sense of the term, but from the Chinese diplomatic policies point of view, there was a shift, there was a swing in the pendulum from America first to Eurasia first. That's the basic background to the BRI. But there were other regions too. I'm going to skip the slide on the decline in US-China relations. I think you're familiar with that. This is what I was talking about now, from America first to Eurasia first. And the basic idea the Chinese explained is to connect the Asian economic region on the one hand and the European economic region on the other. The first centered on China, the second centered on Germany. They don't say it very clearly, but that's what it is. And develop the routes in between. That was the original idea, right? So that's that. And it's not only about investing in communications projects, but also the Chinese say we will come up with common institutions with nations in between so that we can facilitate trade and investment, right? But why was it that they came up with this? One issue was, as I said, the problem with the United States. That's one background. But there are other factors too. Right? Some Chinese started to think that if we developed to the eastern side of our country, we tend to cause frictions. On the maritime front, with the Japanese, with the Americans, with the South Koreans, with the Southeast Asian nations surrounding the South China Sea. It's not very good. And on the Pacific side, now President Obama was saying it out loud, we should make the rules. If we didn't make the rules, the Chinese will make the rules. So he was making it very clear that TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from the American point of view, it was a measure against the Chinese economic advancement. Well, okay, if we go to the east, we have problems, so why don't we turn to the west of our nation and try and develop an international order, a new international order with standards coming out of Beijing on the western side. So some people, not all perhaps, but some people in China started to think in that direction. And also there was the economic aspect, the economic factor of things. I think you're very familiar that when the world financial crisis broke out in 2008 from the United States, the Lehman Brothers shock triggered the world financial crisis. Some Chinese became very confident on the one hand. They started talking about the China model in a big way. But at the same time, they were also in economic trouble for a while, very serious. They were even in trouble before the eruption of the financial crisis. But with the eruption of the financial crisis, the policy debate inside China was over, and they went for this massive development of their domestic market. Yes. Huge investments in buildings, in highways. If you go to China, you see a fantastic network of highways all around the country, and the development of another fantastic network of high-speed railways. Yes. That was, all those were built after 2008, most of them. Many big buildings, huge buildings, not only in big cities, but also in the local towns. You go around China, everywhere. So that's how they pulled out of the economic crisis faster than other countries, and were looked up by many other countries as the new locomotive of the global economy. That's fine. But after several years, the domestic market saturated. Are the high-speed railways making money? The very sad situation is, the answer, generally speaking, is no. There are only a few lines, apparently, making good business, but not others. The Japanese are very familiar with the high-speed railways business. It's very difficult to make money, high-speed railways. Highways, well, some lines, yes, making money, but not in others. But that's one thing. Anyway, the domestic market was saturated, and excessive capacities in construction, in production, they had to find another place to go. And why not the BRI? Why not abroad? Why not Central Asia? Why not Southern and South Asia? So that was another important factor that promoted the BRI, as many of you would know. Now, how was BRI received by the world and by the Chinese nationals themselves? Well, abroad, it attracted great attention. They went, wow, what? Silk Road of the 21st century? How romantic. And it sounds so grand and great, covers all over. And they see glittering Chinese renminbi. And so, wow, this is great. Come to our country. We are all for it. We want to take part in it. That was one kind of general attitude. And within the country, oh yes, and therefore, in March 2015, when the end of March 2015 was a deadline for countries to raise their hands if they wanted to be the founding members of the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? And you remember that towards the end of March, suddenly the Cameron cabinet in the UK raises its hand. Yes, me, I'm joining. And there was an avalanche. All the Western European countries, even America's allies such as Australia, South Korea, they joined at the last minute. And then there was euphoria in Beijing. We won. Come on, look at all the countries that decided to join the AIIB. But in my view, by the summer of that year, in 2015, the euphoria had dissipated. Because the Chinese people are very pragmatic. They're very clever people, as we all know. So, many people started to question, are we really going to build a high-speed railway through Kazakhstan, through Kyrgyzstan, through Turkey? No way. It's not going to make money. And therefore, not only outside of China, but actually inside China, especially today, but it started a lot earlier. In 2015, it was already like that. There are people who question the validity, the economic validity of this whole idea. So that's the domestic. But domestically, people also understand the politics of it. You know, because as Ambassador Kanta just said, it's a signature project now of Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping has consolidated it so solidly. So in order to win the budget from the government, you have to write the magic word, BRI. This project serves BRI, contributes to BRI. You know, so people, at least on the surface of things, say, hurrah, BRI is fantastic. That's the situation in China now. And some inland areas are very excited, genuinely, because they see an opportunity here. You know, no longer the coastal cities, but now the growth rates are higher in certain inland areas because of the BRI boom. But outside China, there was another kind of voice, right? Some people were very happy, but on the other hand, certain countries got very worried because The whole idea about creating a new international order seemed to be very disrupting. And for some countries who had started early with the cooperation with the Chinese realized that it's not that good as it sounded. Some projects did not come by, although they had been promised, or they were slow in coming. Implementation, they only used Chinese companies and workers. So there were second thoughts beginning to arise. But on the whole, it was received very well. But we should be careful that some of the voices of concern arises from the fact that there was some misunderstanding, because the BRI projects are not donations, as you know. They're not aid, they're not ODA. I asked once the president of ADB, the Asia Development Bank, Mr. Nakao, former member of the Ministry of Finance of Japan. He has been very cooperative, AIIB. Mr. Jinping, the president of AIIB, and Mr. Nakao are on very good terms. ADB has been assisting in many ways and doing co-financing projects and so on and so forth. I asked Mr. Nakao, what's the difference between your bank and the AIIB? And he answered immediately, well, we are cooperative with the AIIB, but the difference is that we are a development bank. They are an infrastructure investment bank. That's the big difference. So when the Chinese people argue that AIIB is fantastic, BRI is fantastic, because the previous financial institutions were not supplying the money to fill in the gap between the demand for infrastructure, which is very, very big, and the supply of projects. And China is going to fill in this gap. They often criticize the previously existing organizations for not doing enough to fill in this gap. But actually the reason why the gap exists is because infrastructure projects are very difficult. First, it's difficult to make money, and then you have to nowadays consider the environment. If you're building a dam, what are you going to do about the people living there? Development Bank has to care all of these issues, and therefore they're very prudent in formulating infrastructure projects these days. Whereas Investment Bank, or rather BRI is mainly business. So although the Development Bank, the National Development Bank of China, the Exim Bank of China are supposed to be policy banks, banks with a policy nature, different from purely commercial banks. But their behavior, if you observe them, have been not quite policy-oriented banks, but rather they do not lower the interest rates to the levels of yen loans or other loans that are provided by the international developmental agencies. So there could have been some misunderstanding in creating disappointment on the part of the outside world. But there's another factor that caused concern amongst the other countries, and that was the actions that the Chinese had been taking before that for several years, especially after 2008, when the world financial crisis broke out. Especially from the neighboring nations' point of view, it was the maritime advancement that was a large concern, immediate concern on the part of countries surrounding the East China Sea and the South China Sea. I'm not going to go into details because I think you know about the Chinese Coast Guard vessels intruding into the territorial waters, or the oil development department putting this huge rig to the South China Sea where there are disputes, and the Vietnamese protested vehemently about that, and the construction of artificial islands, harassing of fishing boats and reconnaissance vessels, and so on and so forth. I call this action firstism because it seems nowadays that China has this pattern of behavior that they will seize an opportunity and act when they can, and let diplomacy take care of the rest. So that's what I call action first, diplomacy second. Action firstism as a behavioral pattern on the part of the Chinese in recent years. So that combined with concerns about PRI has risen the level of caution amongst many foreign countries. But the Chinese words have been very soft, very nice, very soothing. Yes, Xi Jinping, when he went to Indonesia and announced about this 21st century maritime Silk Road, he told the Indonesian parliament that problems in the South China Sea will be solved peacefully, on equal footing. We have to develop friendly relations. He said all the right things that no one could object, and it sounded so good. But what actions followed that was very different from his words. So generally speaking, it's easy for us to identify a huge gap between their soft words and their tough deeds. Unfortunately, that has been a fact. And to think about the causes, the reasons why this gap happens, I think simply put, the basic factor is because now they have the capabilities. So they can do things that they were not able to do before. That's the basic point. If you look at the military strategy of the Chinese Navy, it says that whenever there is a chance, militarily, diplomatically, economically, politically, you should act. That's what they've been saying all since the end of the Cold War. Secondly, they don't respect rules very much. You know, many countries were saddened when, in 2016, when the Hague International Arbitral Tribunal ruling came out, China just ignored it. One important guy said it's just waste paper. But one big name in international relations in the United States said, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, to the effect, it doesn't matter. Because China is now a big power. Big powers don't abide by international rules. Look at us. We don't follow international rules very well. Oh, come on, wait a minute. I was so angry, actually, to read that. Because it was as if he was saying, oh, you have joined the big boys club. Come, it's okay. You don't have to abide by international rules. But if big countries do take that attitude, all the others are doomed. We fought 2 terrible world wars in the last century. And what were our lessons? Our lesson, the most important lesson, was that whenever we have international conflicts, we should not use force or the threat of force. And that's why that's written very prominently in the very early part of the UN Charter. Idealism? Yes, but idealism is important. And we have to keep on reminding the big powers that you must abide by international rules. But to think of it, the order inside China is not based on rule of law either. I call it Pax Communista, which means an order that is supported by the outstanding power of the Chinese Communist Party. There's no rule of law in China. Although 30 odd years ago, Deng Xiaoping and his friends tried very hard to introduce rule of law. I acknowledge that, but unfortunately they have not been successful. And to this day, there's no rule of law. And to some people in China, it seems as if the Pax Sinica that they envisage around China or beyond is just an extension of Pax Communista. So they don't respect rule of law. We were much disappointed in 2016. But for the Chinese Communist Party, maybe to have some friction with the outside world is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, because if you are seen as weak-kneed by the people of China, they fear that more than some friction with the outside world. You know, with the nationalistic sentiment that the Communist Party itself has contributed very much in raising, you know, it's very easy to be criticized as weak-kneed by the nationalistic people. So rather than having a critique come from within China, it's better. Some friction existed from the outside, with the outside. Some critique came from outside. Then the Communist Party can use the nationalistic sentiments to unite the party and to unite the nation. Another factor is probably Xi Jinping's propensity to act. You know, there's some personal leadership element here. One quiz, who said this? On the 19th of July, that's 1 week after the Hague Tribunal ruling. somebody said Chinese nation's energy has been suppressed for too long. Let it explode and realize the China dream. Of course it's him, Xi Jinping, the Winnie the Pooh. But he didn't say this directly to the Navy. He didn't say this directly to the Coast Guards or the Fishery Department either. He made those remarks to factory workers in Ningxia, Huizhou autonomous region, inland part of China. So I suspect, I should think that the reason why he said that was he wanted to encourage the workers there using such patriotic or nationalistic language. So that's that. But once he utters those words, they will be reported and they will be transmitted to other parts of the government, other parts of the party, and it could have been the case that the Coast Guards heard this, the Fishery Department heard this, and 2 weeks after these remarks, which happened to be made 1 week after the Hague International Arbitral Tribunal ruling, over 200 boats, fishing boats, came to the territorial waters and contiguous zone around the Senkakus with scores of Coast Guard vessels. And we were puzzled why they were doing this, because it was just before the G20 summit meeting in Hangzhou, China, and it must have been a season for diplomacy. And in fact, Wang Yi came 2 weeks after the fishing boats with full smiles, first time as foreign minister to Japan, and all smiles, asking Abe to come to Hangzhou. Don't criticize the Chinese when you're in China. So we were puzzled. Why are they doing this? And maybe because the Japanese were very critical about China's ignoring of the Hague Tribunal ruling. So they were demonstrating that if you intrude into South China Sea issues, we can do this in the East China Sea. That's one interpretation that is still popular to this day. But another factor, additional factor, could have been the remarks by Xi Jinping. That's a possibility. Another problem, the last one, problem in self-perception. You know, big powers tend to have this big power syndrome, I would call. That is, self-perception is not done very well. I cite 3 examples. One is, you know, this term, peripheral diplomacy. The Chinese official translation, this is, they call their neighborhood diplomacy peripheral diplomacy. So I tell my Chinese friends, don't use this word. And they ask me, they're puzzled. They ask me, why? Why can't we say this? I say, if you call your neighborhood diplomacy peripheral diplomacy, it implies that you think you are at the center. And the Chinese go, oh, you're right. But I've never thought about that. We should change the translation. But they haven't changed it yet. That's one thing. That one example. Another example, Xi Jinping. He loves to talk about the DNA in the Chinese blood. He often said in his speeches that the blood of the Chinese nation does not contain the DNA to invade others and become a hegemon. Wait a minute. Don't say that in front of the Vietnamese. They think they've been invaded by China 1,000 times. Yeah? And another example is Zhenghe or Chongho in some languages. You know, the great admiral in the early 15th century, in the Ming Dynasty period. He actually was a Muslim living in what's today Kunming, Yunnan province. And that area was invaded by the Ming Dynasty. And he was captured and castrated. He became a eunuch, but he was a great man apparently. So the Emperor Yongle loved him very much and made him the admiral, the greatest admiral of the history of China. And he led this huge fleet of huge Chinese vessels, much bigger than the boats of the European imperialists that came in later centuries. Made many voyages to Southeast Asia, even to Africa, right? And the Chinese say he's a symbol of our peaceful maritime advancement. Why? Because they say, unlike the terrible European imperialists, Zheng He did not make any single piece of land a colony. Did not colonize any land. And Zheng He did not make a single person a slave. Who could have been true. So Zhenghe was good in not doing those things. But 5 years before, 5 years ago, I went to Sri Lanka, visited their National History Museum in Colombo, and I was with another friend of mine. And he suddenly calls me, Akio, come, look at this. I said, what is it? They say here, we were invaded by Zhenghe. What? I've never heard of an invasion by Zhenghe. He didn't give a lot of explanation there, so I had to go home and check out. And I found out that one of the important purposes of Zhenghe's voyages was to extend the tributary system. So there were a few kingdoms on the island of Ceylon at that time, and one king refused to have Emperor Yongle as his emperor. You know, what the hell? So then Zhenghe was very angry, attacked the kingdom, captured the whole king's family, and took them away to China. That was the story. That was the reason why it said in the National History Museum that they were invaded by Zhenghe. And it turned out that in many other parts, not many, some other parts of Southeast Asia, like Java, there are similar episodes. So when I wrote about this in a web, in a one Korean think tank, there was also a Chinese professor who was to respond to what I wrote. And he wrote saying that Takahara does not understand his history correctly. But wait a minute, let's seek truth from facts. You know, I'm not a historian, so I'm only copying what other historians have said. But it's difficult for the Chinese to take these critiques in. They have not been told about many facts. So these are some episodes explaining what I mean by the big power syndrome. Let's get back to the BRI. Here it is relatively clear, but the word constellation is written deliberately in bright yellow so that you won't be able to see it very clearly. Because, in my view, BRI is like a constellation. You know, Xi Jinping is pointing at the sky. Look at all the stars there. They are all the projects that the Chinese have been doing. You see a dragon there. That's the Belt and Road. And people go, wow, looks great. But have you ever seen a constellation? I don't think you have. It's only in your brain, right? It's only in the drawing. But in reality, there's no constellation, right? What's tangible, what's real are the stars, the projects. The projects are there, yes. Even the old projects are counted as part of the BRI. It doesn't matter. Yes, there are many stars there. So my view basically is that we should not be mesmerized. We should not be dazzled by the constellation. We should be focusing, not only us outsiders, I mean foreigners, but even the Chinese people. They should be focusing on the stars, the projects. And if the projects are good, you know, well, then we can cooperate. If the stars are only to serve the interests of China, if the stars are not profitable, then we should leave them. We should not cooperate. That had been my idea, and I was happy to find out 2 years ago that Mr. Abe started to say similar things. He started to say that we can cooperate with the BRI. Yes, it's like Ambassador was telling us. We can cooperate with the BRI, but with 4 conditions. 1, it should be open, openness. It should not be exclusive to the Chinese funds. Yes. 2, transparent, no corruption. It should be a transparent endeavor. And 3rd, the project should be economically viable, profitable, bankable. And 4thly, it should not affect the fiscal health of the recipient nation. So no debt traps of that kind. So these 4 conditions, if they are met, we can cooperate with the BRI. Abe has repeated this, as you may know. I think it's a right approach to the projects of the BRI. And if I were to define what BRI is, I would define it as the symbol of Xi Jinping's authority and power. Just like reform and opening, in Chinese characters there are four, 改革开放. Very difficult to define 改革开放, as difficult as defining BRI. Have you ever seen a clear definition of the Belt and Road Initiative? I don't think you have, because Chinese Communist Party is not giving a very clear definition. They say, under BRI, we do this and that and that. But then what is BRI itself? No answer. Reform and opening, very difficult to define. Is it policy? Is it direction? Is it what? There's a lot of stories I can tell you about reform and opening. Because of time, let me just ask one quiz. Do you know in which year the People's Daily, the organ of the Chinese Communist Party, which year was it that the People's Daily published these four Chinese characters, 改革开放, reform and opening first? Many people would answer 1978, right? Because many people now believe that 1978 is the start of reform and opening. Why? I feel ashamed that as an academic, I used to write over 10 years ago that reform and opening started in 1978. To that, I came to realize I used to believe that because that's the narrative of the Chinese Communist Party. And when I checked what happened in 1978, because nowadays a lot of memoirs are coming out, so we can read other views, not the party line, but other views. And it turns out that in 1978, of course, was not the year that the 改革开放 was printed in the People's Daily. By the way, the answer is 1984. And in 1984, only twice. And many people believe that reform started in the countryside with the household responsibility system, breaking up eventually the People's Communists. Why? Because the Chinese Communist Party has been telling us so. But if you check, it turns out that at the so-called third plenum, which is the watershed according to the CCP, household responsibility system in the countryside was categorically denied at the plenum. Can you believe it? But Deng Xiaoping and his friends wanted to rewrite the history because, in my definition, 改革开放, reform and opening, is a symbol of Deng Xiaoping's authority and power. So they want to say that already in December 1978, Deng Xiaoping's authority and power was established. But the fact is otherwise. So we really have to be careful when we access Chinese concepts and Chinese words and check all the time. Not only the Western media, the Chinese media, we always have to check what the reality is. But then what about FOIP? The free and open Indo-Pacific. You know, please don't get it wrong. It's not the Americans that invented this. It's the Japanese. We were first to come up with this notion of the free and open Indo-Pacific. But I'm sorry to my foreign ministry friends, but to me, it's another constellation. Well, it's not a criticism, really. Constellations are fine. But what really matters, I think, are the projects. What are the projects that are going to come by? What are the stars that are going to be there to constitute our constellation? Because if you look up the homepage of the Japanese foreign ministry, you will find phrases like this that I put up here. Well, the FOIP vision, we call it the vision now. Yeah? Unlike the Americans, who are still keeping it the strategy, we have made it clear that we have our priority on economic cooperation. So we changed how we call it. The idea is to improve connectivity between Asia and Africa through free and open Indo-Pacific and promote the stability and prosperity of the region as a whole. Well, it sounds nice, but not so concrete. What's the difference is it going to bring? Not very sure, right? So I think the Japanese government, together with friends like India or America or could be China, we have to come up with concrete projects to as a symbol of our vision of FOIP. And then FOIP will be more convincing, more persuasive. That's the basic thing. And why do I want to say that BRI and FOIP are compatible? Because if we think of the fact that the two initiatives have two aspects. The BRI has its strategic aspect, geopolitical, geo-economic aspect, zero-sum type. Yeah? FOIP also has the strategic aspect, but we cannot deny it. There is competition, just like between Japan and China. On the security front, there is competition going on. So BRI and FOIP have something to do with that. But at the same time, there is the other dimension, the other aspect of economic cooperation, and therefore we can share a star. We do a project together. Mr. Abe, when he visited Beijing last October, at that occasion, 52 MOUs were signed between Japan and China, Japanese side and Chinese side, about cooperation in third country markets. And if they come to fruition, we will have stars that are shared by FOIP. We would call them part of FOIP. They can call them part of BRI. So we can coexist and co-prosper. Although in reality, it's difficult to find those good projects because infrastructure projects don't make money. And good projects, both sides will want to do it by ourselves. So how can we find a good joint project? It's a difficult task, but we will get that because we want to coexist and co-prosper with China. Although we have the dilemma in front of us. The question of security will always be there. So we want China to change, but we cannot change the Chinese. Now, I'm going to skip this on Japan-China relations. If I had time, I'd like to explain to you the current situation of Japan-China relations using this very simple analytical model. But just one word. I came up with this analytical model after editing volume on the history of Japan-China relations past 40 odd years, since 1972, when we normalized our relations. And it occurred to me that all the factors that impact Japan-China relations can be bundled into 4 areas. Domestic politics of the two countries, certainly. Diplomacy is an extension of domestic politics. Economic interests, of course, right? And international environment and security, they are very important factors in our bilateral relations, any bilateral relations. But in Northeast Asia, people's perceptions, identity, how should we be viewed by other countries? What sort of an existence should we be in the region? Those can be counted as one independent variable. It's so important. Look at Japan-South Korea relations now. People's perceptions linked with domestic politics. You see all the arrows, they're interrelated. Overwhelming security concerns and economic interests, which is very silly, I would say, but that's what it is. So this can be applied to other bilateral relations too. But basically, I wanted to emphasize the point that Japan-China relations is in the upbeat. We are improving our relations. So until up to the point when Xi Jinping visits Japan next, that is going to be either March or April next year, our relations are going to be better and better and better. But after that, no one is sure, because all the other factors are positive. But one factor that is negative is security, sovereignty. That's a basic stumbling block that prevents the development of Japan-China relations. And I can show that in this graph. Sorry, the bottom part is in Japanese, but let me explain. The green line shows the percentage of Chinese people who have a good image of Japan. And the blue line at the bottom shows the percentage of Japanese people who have a good image of China. You can see that the image of Japan amongst the Chinese people is getting better and better and better. Yeah? Very rapid increase. So when my Chinese friends see this graph, they're shocked. Why? Why the Japanese people don't like us, don't have a good image of us? But from the Japanese point of view, don't you see it? It's so obvious. And actually the same public survey asks those who answered they don't have a good image of China. Why? And the 3 biggest reasons. 1, because the Chinese keep on sending their Coast Guard vessels into the territorial waters. Just think, if Vietnam was sending their Coast Guard vessels into the Paracels territorial waters 3 times a month, what would the Chinese people think about Vietnam? Pretty obvious. And the second biggest reason was because the Chinese don't abide by international rules. I think those who answered that had the South China Sea Arbitral Tribunal very much in mind. And the third biggest reason was because China criticizes Japan over history and other issues. But that's not new. So security, sovereignty issues, unless China changes its behavior, this is not going to change as far as the Japanese are concerned. Okay? Then how should we respond? I'm coming to the conclusion. How should we respond? We cannot but develop our network of security cooperation, try to balance. We have to we have to mobilize everything to maintain peace. It's not easy. So, the 3 major schools of international relations, realists basically think balance of power is the way to maintain peace, right? So that, I think, there is some truth to that. So despite the fiscal limitations that Japan is facing, we cannot but try our best we cannot keep pace with China's rapid increase in their defense budget, but anyway, we will do our best to balance that. And the second school of thinking is liberalism, right? Interdependence is the way to maintain peace. There's some truth in that too. So we should cooperate with the Chinese where we can. In Japan-China relations, we have the resilient aspect and the fragile aspect. Yes? If there was not for the resilience in our relationship, in the 7 years, we could not have improved our relation from that bottom in 2012, the conflict of the Senkakus, to this point in such a short amount of time. So economic cooperation, we should deepen, we should broaden, and as I mentioned, BRI and FOI coexistence is one way of doing that. And that's fine. But the other school of thinking in IR is constructivism. They think that peace can be maintained by sharing common values, having sharing norms, common norms, things like that. I think there's some truth to that. So we should have more intellectual exchange with the Chinese. We should try public diplomacy because there's such a huge perception gap between the Chinese and the Japanese. I'm sure there are between the Chinese and the Indians too. So we have to somehow narrow this perception gap. But it's not easy because in many cases the perception gap is based on information gap. And the Chinese Communist Party have very tight control over the flow of information in China, right? I'll show you some examples. What caused tension in the East China Sea? Yes.
You had a bullet
Yes.
where you said we can't change China.
Yes. Yes, okay.
On that?
Sure. If China doesn't change its behavior, if China keeps on increasing its military might with the current policy, the competition part cannot but intensify. We don't want that. We want the Chinese to behave differently, stop action firstism, and refrain from using the physical force in the way that they are doing today. The number of vessels coming into the territorial waters 3 times a month have actually going up this year, despite the improvement in diplomatic relations. So we want to change China, but can we? I don't think so. We cannot change China. It's only the Chinese people that can change China. Then what do we do? The Chinese people are changing by themselves, but we can facilitate that change. That's what I mean by we can change the Chinese. I'm sure there are the young Chinese that you meet in India, or there are lots that come to our universities or universities in Europe or North America. Many of them are very bright, open-minded, can objectively observe what's happening in their own country. Some are nationalistic these days because of education under Xi Jinping. This is problematic. But after a while, they will come to see different value systems, how other societies are run, and begin to appreciate some other ways than how their own country is run. That's what I mean. I think we need to provide more opportunities for them to come over because public diplomacy easily said but difficult to implement. Person-to-person contact, I should think, is the best. Why is the image of Japan getting better and better in China? No one has done a very thorough scientific research into this, but many people guess that it's got something to do with the increasing number of tourists that come to Japan. If you come to Japan, you will hear Chinese everywhere. They speak very loudly, that's one reason. but there are so many Chinese in shopping areas, even in my university on campus. What I hear most is Chinese. It's not only because of the students. A lot of tourists come into the campus of the University of Tokyo with their kids, they bring them. But that's fine. And they use the social networking services, the social media, to tell their family members, to tell their friends that the Japan that they actually have come and seen are different from what they had learned back in China. So, however, the difficulty is there's a big perception gap. We in Japan think the recent tension is all China's fault. And the Chinese, sorry, that's the other way around. The Chinese think it's all Japan's fault. I'm not going to go into this. If there's a question, I'll go into the details, but it takes some time, so I'm going to skip it. But anyhow, sorry, this is quite fun, so I'm going to show it to you. This is a picture that was distributed by Xinhua news agency one day after the collision of the fishing boat and the Coast Guard vessels of the Japanese side in 2010. One day after the collision. Yeah, it shows two Japanese big Coast Guard vessels hitting the belly of a small Chinese trawler. This is what the Chinese got, the ordinary people got. But isn't it a bit odd? How did they know that this happened? It was only one day after the incident. There was no Chinese around when this happened. The captain, the crew, they were still held by the Japanese side. It's very odd, very strange. It turns out that this is a sheer political fabrication because what the Japanese side people got was this. This is the leaked video. You know, somehow, for some reason that I don't quite understand, the Japanese Coast Guard had not officially released the video that they had been taking about when the incident happened. But one officer of the Japanese Coast Guard was very frustrated, and he leaked this video, and you can watch it on YouTube even today. So clearly, this is not what happened. This video is worth watching once. So if you haven't, go to the URL, the link, and take a look. So I'm saying the difficulty in narrowing the information gap. Are the Japanese media free from mistakes? Not at all. Not at all. I should have brought some examples of the problems in the Japanese side. But once Xi Jinping in May 2015 gave a very friendly speech to 3,000 Japanese who were led by Mr. Nikai to China, Xi Jinping suddenly emerged at the People's Hall and gave the most friendly speech that I had ever heard since Uyaoban in the 1980s. But when the Japanese media reported about it, one Japanese media took one small part of his speech. He had one sentence saying that any distortion of history will not be tolerated by the Chinese and the conscientious Japanese people. Makes sense. Ordinary people will have no objection about that. But then the title that some media gave to the speech was, "No historical distortion allowed," said President Xi. That was the title, and it gave a very different impression, very wrong impression about the speech. These things happen in the media, right? So we have to find other ways to promote mutual understanding. And it's not easy. 8 million Chinese came to Japan as tourists last year. That's quite significant. But they have 1.4 billion people. But I suppose that's the right way forward. We have to promote human to human exchange. But if there are any other good ways, I'll be very willing to learn. Sorry, I spoke for too long, but let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I'm sure all of you were hearing this talk with absolute rapt attention as I was. Just thank Professor Takahara for a most interesting and informative talk. I mean, there was a lot of history, there's a lot of perceptions of the Chinese side, I think, trying to in many ways explain the Chinese point of view on some issues. And also trying to say that maybe the BRI and the FOIP can work together. I think in that point of view that the BRI is not something that other countries can't work with, our Prime Minister himself took a lead when he said that the free and open Indo-Pacific, as far as we were concerned, was free, open and added inclusive. So the possibility of being able to work with others. But I think what is interesting certainly about the free and open Indo-Pacific is that that means different things to different people. So I don't think there is one definition. I'll open the floor for questions. Please just give your name and let's have the questions as brief as possible because that's our here. Deference is a senior.
My name is J.S. Iyer. The 11th point is that I used to be the minister in the embassy, our embassy in your country, long time back. I went there 37 years back. Old story. Around the time Mr. Nakasone became Prime Minister, to put it in your political context. You alluded to one particular issue, whether you would like to step into it deeper, I would like to know. Now, all of us agree that Taiwan is part of China, in the map. And of course, other than in the map, we haven't accepted. Hardly any country has. Thank you. Now, what do you see as, let's say, medium term prospect of the Chinese government in Beijing obtaining full control or a substantial control over Taiwan? In that case, what will be the kind of responses that you see your government and your country adopting? And as I said, I am fully aware of the history between Japan and Taiwan. Thank you, sir.
We'll take a couple of questions, but we don't have to. Let's take it together.
Yes.
Just
Vijay Naik, I'm a journalist. We've talked about BRI just now. But last week there was news that Japan and US are thinking of alternative to BRI. Is there a possibility of India, Japan, Australia, and the four countries actually coming together to give an alternative to BRI of China?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, compliments. The talk was riveting. Let me also say that you do not know your history professor as the world does not know the history. Only China knows history. And that will change every day. So please don't feel very bad about not knowing Chinese history. Anyways, couple of very quick questions. My name is Ambassador Vishnu Prakash. I have served in Japan, Korea, China, Russia, etc. and been following the region. One about BRI. Do you see there is talk of BRI 2.0? Because they say that or believe that the officials have been bashful about giving feedback about the pushback on BRI to the president. But there is a possibility that there will be some changes. Do you see that happening? Secondly, on the South China Sea, the militarization of the South China Sea, would you agree that, or how is it that they went about militarizing South China Sea so blatantly from 2008 onwards while the world sat and just watched? And would you think that or agree that a lot of blame can be pinned to Obama's door, who only warned but didn't do anything, especially in 2012 when the Scarborough Shoals were invaded and taken over by China? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent questions. They're really hitting bullseye. Taiwan, short answer would be, if mainland China acted on Taiwan, that would be a nightmare, not only for Japan, but for the world, I think. So the Japanese will try its best to avoid such an incident to happen, but it might depend on the economic situation in China. There could be temptation for a diversionary diplomacy or diversionary external act. The Chinese Communist Party leaders are always so conscious about their lack of legitimacy to rule, and therefore, as we heard from the director of the Hong Kong Macau office on the 7th of August this year, even that movement in Hong Kong to the Chinese leaders is a color revolution, which is very odd to many of us. How can a small Hong Kong cause a color revolution in China? But they are always very worried. And if the Chinese economic condition gets worse, it's going downhill now, and if there's a lot of social instability, they may be tempted to do something with the outside world. And the Vietnamese are worried about it. I understand some Indians are worried about that. And the Taiwanese can be very worried about it too. So if that happens, it depends on how it happens. There are all sorts of scenarios. Is it going to be a missile exercise again, like in 1996? Or is it going to be the encirclement or containment of some islands close to mainland China, to the continent? Or are they going to blockade the whole of Taiwan? There are many scenarios, I think, and I hope that our authorities are ready for all sorts of scenarios. But in any case, generally speaking, if China moves on Taiwan, it's going to cause havoc. Very difficult situation will emerge out of that. But looking at how the Hong Kong people are resisting the encroachment of their autonomy from mainland China, maybe the leadership in Beijing will think twice, even though there was this temptation. If they succeeded in occupying the whole of Taiwan island, what are they going to face? Resistance after resistance after resistance will take place. So, what would be the benefit that would accrue from such a move, if you think about all the sacrifices, all the negative impacts that it would cause? Alternative to BRI, so important. Thank you for bringing this up. I think what we should be doing is coming up with alternatives, because from the developing countries' point of view, or even from other developed countries' point of view, Chinese money is very attractive, and it helps them when they are in times of need. No other country comes, and China raises its hand, and they're coming. So it's wonderful for them. But I've been telling the Pakistanis and the Sri Lankans that, okay, other countries didn't come, but only China came. Why? You have to think about the reason why the Chinese decided to come. Because if the other countries decided not to come, it means that there's some reason that they're not coming. And if China is going to come despite those reasons, it means that they are after something, or they could be reckless in the sense that they don't do the feasibility studies very well. And the recipient countries could be happy for a while because the money's come in, the construction's being done, But after the construction is finished, is it really going to make money or not? Most likely not, if the other countries are not coming. Which means that they'll be in big trouble after the completion of the project. So in order to avoid these things, you have to think well twice and look for alternatives. The problem is there's no alternatives now. So I think you're very right that we should come up with good alternatives. The advantage of ours is that we have better project formulation capacities than China. China is very good at constructing things, but they're not good at formulating the projects. So in fact, it will be to the benefit of China to cooperate more with countries like Japan, who have good experience in formulating, designing these projects. And we can also make good use of China's money. Now, what's wrong about that? So in the alternatives, we've been helping the Chinese develop for the past how many years? Do you know that it was only last year we stopped ODA to China? Even after the clashes that we've been having over the fishing incident or 2012, it sounds very silly, but the Japanese kept on providing ODA to China. Only symbolically, the amount was rather small, but we could have stopped long time ago. But we kept on doing that. Why? Because we really want China to develop in a sustainable way. The interdependence is such that we would be all in big trouble if China's economy falls. So anyway, alternatives so important. So countries like Japan, India, United States, Australia, and we should not be exclusive. If China wants to come in, why not? Let's do it together. You are rich now for the time being, so please. We won't say that, but so now is the chance for us to make good use of Chinese money. BRI 2.0 is very interesting because if you compare the speeches by Xi Jinping in the two BRI summits 2 years ago and this year, you see a notable difference. This year, Xi Jinping talks more about openness. He mentions transparency, the fiscal condition of the recipient country. Wait a minute, where did we hear this? It's part of the four conditions that Abe had provided, in cooperating with the BRI. So I think Mr. Abe has done very well, very clever. Unlike some other countries across the Pacific. Sorry, there are any people from the United States, but in the United States, people are now bashing China, trashing China. But BRI is a very important signature project for Xi Jinping. So if you tickle that, China will respond. And China wants to do the BRI well. And therefore, I think Abe's approach was the right one. And I think many countries will benefit from Abe's effort to change the course of BRI. So that's on BRI 2.0. And on the South China Sea, the militarization, I think they did it boldly because they saw a chance. As I said, it's written clearly. I mean, it's not open, but I had some access to the strategy of the Chinese Navy, which is rewritten in 1993 after the end of the Cold War, after the first Gulf War. We saw the military revolution on the part of the Americans. The Chinese were shocked about the science and technological development that the American military was making. So they came up with a new strategy and a new plan to develop their military forces in 1993. And in it says very clearly, if we have military chance in terms of military affairs, chance in terms of diplomacy, chance in terms of economics, and so on and so on, we will move. And I think they saw an opportunity in 2012, 2014, 2015, and I cannot but blame the Obama administration for that. Especially the security advisor in the second administration. I don't know why she didn't pay much attention, or she refused to pay attention to these developments.
Thank you, Professor. In talking about alternatives to the BRI, of course, we did try this Asia-Africa growth corridor, which seems to have run aground, and we're not hearing very much about it. And recently, I think there was a report which said that EU and Japan were trying to look at something on quality infrastructure just this month. So I think people are looking at alternatives. We'll take the second round of questions. Ashok, can I start with you? And the gentleman at the back, please. Anyone else?
Thank you very much. I'm Ashok Sajjanha, I'm former ambassador. My compliments to you also. Just one comment to what you said, Deepa, just now, because I think last year when Prime Minister Modi went to Tokyo, at that time also we had decided that we'll take up projects in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka. So these were some, maybe not very high value, but I think these were some beginnings that the two of us were trying to do. But coming back to my questions, Professor, don't you think that when we are trying to compare or find whether these FOIP and BRI are compatible, we are really comparing oranges and apples? Because BRI, as you said yourself, is projects. And as far as FOIP is concerned, someone has called it strategy, someone has called it vision. My Prime Minister called it a geographical construct. At the Shangri-La dialogue, he sort of just mentioned that there is this construct and we need to sort of work together. So, and we also see, you said, if we can work together, but we've seen that BRI has moved so far ahead. Hundreds of billions of dollars have already been invested in different projects. FOIP is nowhere on the scene. So would it not appear if we say that, we are here, we will collaborate, we are basically succumbing to whatever BRI has been able to do and has been able to achieve. I think secondly, I think everyone recognizes that FOIP came on the scene 10 years, 12 years ago, and FOIP came on the scene in 2017 in Manila because of the rise of China. So if we are sort of, positioning ourselves, the reason why it had risen, and now we say that, we want to cooperate and collaborate because we find ourselves quite inadequate or incapable of sort of, being able to deal with whatever is happening with the BRI, whether it's on the continental part or on the maritime part. And the last comment would be on the Quad. I know there was some reference, but you never mentioned the word Quad. Do you look upon the Quad as a subset of the Indo-Pacific concept, and what do you see as the future going forward? Thank you.
Thanks, Ashok.
Sri Prakash, I'm a former fellow of the Japan Foundation and the Bunker University. You see, I think that, of course, Xi Jinping's initiative, but is it not building upon previous Chinese efforts in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the China ASEAN? It's part of a more systematic Chinese policy than to say that it is one person's initiative, number one. Number two, I think that if you compare with USA, you have the USA under President Trump trying to pull back on all kinds of American commitments from Europe to Asia, giving the impression that the current account of balance or imbalance in the US is bothering the administration. And we have China, on the other hand, actually, as the ambassador pointed out previously, investing hundreds and billions of dollars today. A kind of situation, if you look at the post-Second World War, US expansion of aid, it was USA in the 1950s.
So we have to take some more questions.
Which was expanding its aid and its role in the world. Today it wants to get back to being just a nation state, and it is China which wants to build upon its previous initiatives. How do you see that contrast?
Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Rajiv Bhatia, I'm a former ambassador. Question right to the heart of your presentation. The concept is fine. I think Japanese position today has become much clearer than it was before. The earlier position was quite confusing actually to a lot of people in India. The question is, after that concept is clear, have you found some projects with China that fulfill these four conditions? And what exactly are those projects? Thank you.
I think this gentleman there. Yes, sir.
Comrade Ajay Singh from the Indian Maritime Foundation. Thank you very much for a very, very interesting presentation, Professor. It gave us a whole new perspective. But I'll come down to the maritime aspect of it. You know, the Chinese are building their navy at the rate of almost 25 big ships a year, which is a number which other navies are achieving, taking 10 years to build. Most of the Quad, BRI, etc. has been covered by the various other questions. So my question to you is very simple. How do you think the Chinese navy is going to influence both the BRI and the FOIP? Because to me, the FOIP is a constant in China, otherwise there will no need of a term called FOIP if everyone was living in harmony with each other. So how do you think the Chinese navy is going to counter, and what kind of capacity building will the countries constituting the FOIP, the four, maybe the Quad, be able to counter this? Would the Japanese navy come and support India in the Indian Ocean if there was a confrontation? Would the Indian navy be able to go into the East China Sea and support Japan? Would the American Navy be operating in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean? So these are the sort of contradictions that are coming. And the second question is, will the Chinese juggernaut, this whole naval military build-up, collapse under its own weight in 20-25 years? Will it become unsustainable for them?
Thank you for wonderful questions. Let me begin by, yes, hundreds of billions of dollars invested under the concept of BRI. Well, I'm not sure. Let's count how much money has actually come in and compare that with the hundreds of billions of dollars, for example, that the Japanese have invested in the past. You know, in terms of accumulation of investments assets, at least as far as I know, in Southeast Asia, the Japanese investments are much, much bigger than the amount of money that has come from China. But we tend to see things in flow terms, not in stock terms. So in terms of flow, of course, there's more money coming from China compared to that money coming from Japan now. But we don't say that you know, the FOIP includes all the process that we did in the past. So if we counted all those, maybe the scorecard could be a little different. But in any case, yes, China's the dynamic of China is real, and we've been supporting that, as I told you earlier. So it's a great success case as far as Japanese ODA is concerned. But we should make use of that. That's point number one. And BRI also, we are not too worried about the economic aspect of that. We are, of course, more worried about the security aspect of that. And here comes in the Quad. So I don't deny the Quad. You know, the Quad is necessary, perhaps, in order to maintain the balance on the strategic side of things. But we should never forget that there is the other side of things. And on the other side of things, we should try and make use of this dynamic that the Chinese are enjoying at the moment, and which will not last forever. As I may have already said, but we are very concerned about the current economic conditions in China. If you listen to the remarks that the Chinese leaders make, in late August, it was the head of the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, He Lifeng, and then it was Liu He, the Deputy Prime Minister in charge of economics in early September. When you hear them speak, they say some nice things, of course, but at the same time, their judgment about the current state of affairs in the Chinese economy, domestic, is very bleak, to the extent that outsiders, even outsiders, get worried. You talk to the Chinese ordinary people, I mean the intellectuals and even the cadres, they are very concerned about the future of China. And you see the rich guys, not only this year and last, but for many years have been trying to take their money out of the country. And they have, all the leaders have been sending their children abroad to study. And before it used to be from graduate, postgraduate level. Now from the undergraduate level, even earlier high school level, not only to the States, now it's becoming increasingly difficult to get visas to the States, but to Japan, for example. So I would say that now it's the time that we should cooperate with China, but in good terms and in a way that the projects will be feasible and profitable and sustainable, and we should be able to help the BRI come up with those good projects if they were willing to cooperate. And it would be significant if, as I'm trying to do, to tell the Chinese that when Xi Jinping comes to Japan next March or April, he should say he can cooperate with the Japanese version of FOIP. And that would be a very important message to the world, and especially to this region, that wow, now Japan and China are cooperating over BRI and FOIP. So it should relieve the tension in many countries in this part of the region. And I think it will be good for China, it will be good for Japan, but it should be good for many countries diplomatically in this part of the world. And I think that in itself is quite significant. And we should come up with more concrete projects, but as I mentioned, it's not easy to find a cooperative project. So we've been discussing the 52 MOUs that were signed last October when Mr. Abe visited China. Now the most promising seems to be the industrial zone in Thailand, but let's see how things will grow. But since I'm not a businessman, I'm not too sure what are the other ones. But I have only hopes on that front. However, that's the direction in which we should be moving. Now, on the Chinese Navy, you should tell me. I don't know how we can respond to that scale of naval development. What we know is that the Coast Guards are now closely tucked into the Chinese military, and they themselves are increasing their force in a mighty way. So we cannot but respond by trying our best to increase our Coast Guard fleet and personnel. But besides the balancing and how, when they overwhelm the other side, I don't know. But as you hinted, the overstretching of capacity is something that we will see more, I think, with the slowing down of the Chinese economy. I talked about the huge buildings that they have built inside China and the fantastic networks of high-speed railways and highways. Can they maintain them? No, as I said, the Chinese are good at construction, but they are not good at all in maintenance. And the maintenance will cost a lot of money if they wanted to do it properly. In the past, when buildings got old, they just demolished them and built new ones. But in the future, they will have no money to do that. So how are they going to learn how to maintain things well in a not so costly way? I'm sure it's the same with the ships. When we look at Chinese ships that were built in the past, they all look very rusty and old. They're not good at maintenance. Artificial islands that they created in the South China Sea, it must be very costly to maintain them, right? How are they going to do that when in 5 years' time, or even less, when the fiscal capacity goes down very much? The fiscal deficit is rising. So when we think about the future of China, we get very worried. Because as I said, as I emphasized, we want sustainable development in China. But with the aging problem, with the lack of resources, the lack of water, deterioration of the environment, pollution of land, soil, all these serious problems are there. And they won't be able to maintain. And what was the growth rate exactly last year? They announced 6.6. Was it really 6.6? Many Chinese don't believe that. One well-known economist, the dean of a graduate school in one of the most famous universities in China, asked me late last year, what do you think is the real growth rate of China this year? I said, how should I know? You must tell me. And he said, it's zero. What? Zero? It can't be zero. It's zero. That's what he said. Well, I don't know. No one knows the real growth rate figure, but most likely it's not 6.6, but somewhat lower than that. The social instability arising from economic issues would easily lead to political instability. And we talked about the obsession of a color revolution. All these things make a Japanese China watcher very worried.
Thank you, Professor. We have time for just 2 more questions. Dilip and the gentleman. Ambassador Dilip Sinha.
Dilip Sinha, former diplomat. Thank you, Professor, for your excellent presentation. A question, you mentioned that you had been to Pakistan and to Sri Lanka before coming here. What was your impression of their impression of the BRI in their country?
So please.
Gagan is an infrastructure consultant. 2 questions. The ongoing shadow war going on the telecom, the 5G, the Huawei and the ZTE. The official stand of the Japanese, and what is your position? It's just a false construct made by the West to more or less encircle China. And second, there have been nitpicking on the China-US trade war. I mean, now China is not responding to any tariff barriers, they're lying low. Is it because of the impending elections next year and the Chinese are hoping that there will be a pliable administration, a Democrat one, and then they can move forward on that?
Thank you. They're all fantastic questions. Pakistan and Sri Lanka are slightly different, but basically there's a common feature. That is because there's a lack of alternatives. What can we do? We can only rely on China. Basically, that's what the people in Pakistan and Sri Lanka told me. Understandable, but as I was trying to say, it's not quite ideal to rely only on one country. So alternatives, again, is very important for those two, but they haven't been coming. So it's quite a problematic situation, I'd say. Especially in Pakistan, when I talked about my views on China, there was even some emotional response. I've never heard of anyone criticize China so much, that kind of thing. But, so I told them that I say the same thing in China, and usually I'm welcome, because the Chinese people these days, of course there are some emotional guys in China too, but many Chinese want to know facts that they don't know. So what are the facts that the Japanese know about the Senkakus, the East China Sea? They are open these days. So they have grown their confidence to that extent that they are open to criticisms, they are open to facts that are not suitable to them, favorable to them. 5G, Huawei, so they, people in Pakistan and Sri Lanka generally thought that BRI was fantastic. So what I told them about the BRI sounded very fresh to them, apparently. So I did make some contribution in that sense. US-China, very complicated. But I think the question of Huawei 5G is the same in our countries too, that the security people are very concerned. It's very worried. Maybe they haven't done any bad things in the past, but when the crunch comes, when there's a crisis, they can do many things, so let us not use it. That's the basic attitude, I think, of the security people. But from other people's point of view, it's cheap, it's good, so why not? And I don't really understand technology, honestly speaking. So I once asked the former chief of, I forget the name of the department, but in the UK they have a special department looking into these things. When he came to Japan a couple of months ago, I asked him, I raised a hand after his speech, I want to ask about Huawei. Is it really dangerous? And he gave a long answer, which I didn't comprehend. So it's not quite clear to me what's the best way to handle it. So I'm very sorry about that. But it's a very thorny question. It's a very important question. I understand the importance of it. It relates to both security and economy. And it seems so important in both ways. So I wish I knew more about that.
Thank you so much, Professor Takahara. I think your talk and your responses to the questions, I think, have given a lot of people not only the information they sought, but I think food for thought, because there's another perspective I think that some of us have got from here. Thank you all also for being here. And I think we are going to get a cup of tea outside perhaps.
Please join us for
Please join
tea.
us. Thank you.